Jeremiah chapter 30 and verse 7. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. First and foremost, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Bahashim, Rechak Vadash. Double honors to the elder apostles, the elder bishops, the elders of Great Millstone, who rule very well, very beautifully. Double salutations unto the Akim and her pushing his gospel in truth and in sincerity, to the best of their ability, given to them by Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai. Peace, blessings, and salutations be unto the elect scattered abroad. May the election of Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Lord willing, fall upon your houses. This is Brother Quana Wath coming back at you, Lord will, with the edifying lesson through the spirit and power of Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Lord will. It is edifying, Lord will. It is straight to the point. And I came across this article earlier, and had seen, which, we've been, hearing and seeing, right, within the news and, alternative news and whatnot, right, this term, right, of remigration, that Trump and his administration, mainly Trump, right, has been ultimately throwing around, and then you just had this situation, right, which, we're gonna ultimately get it. I got it, pulled up on the chat. What is remigration, right, and how is it going to affect, right, you Israelites, you so-called blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans? Because we understand that Esau Edom, he has a perpetual hatred pursuant to Ezekiel 35:5, right, for you Israelites, you so-called blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans today, right? And his whole target is you Israelites, right? I mean, we've been seeing that, right? All these different nations of people that came across the border during the the Biden administration and whatnot, right? They were flooding and crossing the border, right? Which we know that was ultimately allowed, right? They did that on purpose, right? So that way Trump can come in and ultimately try to clean up house, right? Which and set up these different laws and policies which will allow him to do so, but nonetheless, Trump came in and immediately after he came in, right, it's been attack on what he's calling you migrants, right, which we know first and foremost, right, are the northern tribes, right, you so-called Hispanics, Latinos, right, and you so-called Native Americans, and that's who's been at the forefront of this immigration crackdown, and whatnot, right? Because again, he has a perpetual hatred for you Israelites, even though there's many different nations that came across the border. He's only coming after the Israelites, man. Which is the reason why I asked, right, how is this remigration going to affect, right, the Israelites, the so-called blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans? And we're gonna get that, but I want to get into this article. And Salaki for the long intro. We understand that we are in the time of Jacob's trouble, right? But we have yet to, hit the peak, right? Which that peak would be, first and foremost, right? The mandatory implementation of the RFID micro CHIP, which is the MO to the TB. But see, again, there has to be a buildup, and we're in the buildup, just like when you're climbing a mountain, right? You have, again, that straight up, then you hit the peak, and then it's straight down, so we're in the buildup, right? We're on the way to hitting, right, that peak. We're on the way to, right, the MO to the TB, which is, again, the RFID micro CHIP, right, being established, right? There's different, again, right, as we're seeing different events and different, plots and schemes, right, that will ultimately allow for, that to happen, right, that prophecy to come to pass. So we're in that, we're on that path, right? All roads to lead to the MO to the TB, right? So this is on the Newsbreak app. It says Trump wants to revoke citizenship from some naturalized Americans. What to know? Now, a naturalized American is somebody who's, either parents or great-grandparents or however it may be, right? Or grandparents, great-grandparents, right? They ultimately came here and, a generation or two, or maybe they're the first generation, right, that were born here, right? They're natural citizens, man, right? They were born here, naturalized, right? Not somebody who, ultimately gained citizenship, right? But somebody who was born here, right? And according to, right, the Constitution, right, those who are born here, right, would ultimately be considered, right, a citizen of the land, and would therefore, right, inherit, the same rights as, a regular citizen, But we'll keep reading. It says, President Trump on Sunday said that he would absolutely denaturalize certain Americans if he could. Right? It says the big picture. It says the Trump administration has intensified its immigration crackdown following last week's deadly attack on National Guard members. Right, which we believe that was, a psyop. Esau ultimately setting up. Because for a minute, and bro's been saying this. For a minute they've been trying to tie, the Hebrew Israelite movement to, the terrorist, the Muslim terrorists and so on and so forth, man. So for there to be a, Afghani national, right, that was ultimately, they're saying he drove from Washington State all the way to Washington, D.C., just to come, shoot some guard member, but they got National Guard in Portland, Oregon, which is, a few hours away rather than 10 to, 20, 25, 2-3 day trip, to however long it took, which don't make no sense. So we believe that this was a psyop. Esau's, getting messy and sloppy and shit, which would, again, open up the door for what you see now, right? Him talking about the, denaturalizing, Americans, right? Because apparently this guy, is some, citizen, of America, right? Gained citizenship, if I'm not mistaken, which made him a naturalized citizen, So he's talking about now taking, away that naturalized citizenship, man, It says what they're saying. It says we have criminals that came into our country and they were naturalized maybe through Biden or somebody that didn't know what they were doing, and that's what Trump was saying, right? That's a quote from Trump, right? It says, if you have the power, if I have the power, another quote, right? If I have the power to do it, I'm not sure that I do, but if I do, I would denaturalize absolutely, right? So Trump also repeated previous anti-immigration comments criticizing people from Somalia who have been living in the U.S. and threatening to pause new asylum claims for a long time, right? It says we don't want those people. Does that make sense? You know why we don't want them? Because they have it says because many have been no good and they shouldn't be in our country, and a while back, right, you had that interview with Trump and that El Salvadorian president, right, and he made that statement, right? It was recorded and he made that statement. Right now it's to to basically focus at home, right? The criminals that are at home, right? The homeborn criminals is what he said, So, hey, there you go, right? So now we're seeing him turn inwards, right? And he's been doing it really since the beginning, of this whole immigration crackdown, which is the beginning of his, his presidency, right? But now he's going harder, man, right? Now he's not just coming for, the migrants, right? The so-called illegals, right? Now he's coming for those that have been here, which will open up the door for, him to come out, not only, the northern tribes, but the southern tribes as well, right? Which he's been doing, right? Getting rid of the HB1 visas and so on and so forth, right? Targeting a lot of these Haitians, right? Which are the southern tribes, right? The so-called Levites, the Levites, right? The so-called Haitians, I'll keep reading. It says the White House and the Justice Department did not immediately respond to requests for comment. The flashback, the U.S. Department of Justice is now prioritizing stripping naturalized Americans of their citizenship when charged with certain crimes, according to a June memo, right? So they're getting ready for this, man, right? Which means, hey, guess what, man? That crackdown is going to happen, right? And we know, right, according to Revelations 12:12, let's grab this real quick, and then we'll get into that, the chat, right? Revelations 12 and verse 12. It says, therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time. Now, a lot of these pagan Christians, right, ultimately look at this and say that this is talking about, that red devil, right, with pitchforks and horns and sharp-ass teeth. But then, no, this is talking about a man, right? Let me grab this blue letter real quick, right? So this is KJV in the blue letter. Let's go ahead and grab that word. Oh, it says no internet. Hold on, let me turn off. Let's see if that pulls up. Right? Boom, boom, Salakia. Right? So let me grab this word, devil, right? Because this proves that it's not talking about, that demon, right? That they fucking, the pagan Christian, as well as the, Catholics and whatnot, they believe that the devil is. No, this is talking about Esau Edom, the self-proclaimed so-called white man, the one who's in charge, who's in control, right? It says Strong's G 1228, Diablos, right? Diablos, right? It says prone to slander, slanderous, right? Accusing falsely, and that's what Esau is, right? But look at this, right? It says metaphor applied to a man who, by opposing the cause of the Most High, and we understand that he opposes the Most High, right? We just heard Noah Yuval Harari, right? Basically said, that God is basically dead. We're just, ultimately, trying to hide the body. That's what he ultimately said, right? Roughly paraphrasing, right? But they've ultimately said they don't need God, right? That they are God of the earth, and they said that multiple times. There's evidence of it, So this is clearly talking about who? Esau Edom, right? It says metaphor, right? Applied to a man who by opposing the cause of the Most High may be said to act a part of the devil or to side with him. So there you go, right? Let's talk about a man today, right? Which we know will be Esau Edom. And again, right? He knows that he has a short time, So this is why he's speeding things up. This is why he's throwing things out there. He's getting sloppy with his little, psyops and whatnot. Right, but nonetheless, majority of these people out here, they're not looking at things through the spirit, right? So they're gonna believe in his little psyops, man, and react to it, right? Which goes back to Esau's problem, reaction, solution, man. Esau is ultimately pointing out, right, and trying to basically bribe you people or make you to believe, to deceive you people, that having, this digital system being set up is a good thing, when in reality, it's just going to lead to, you being a perpetual slave, man, So this is why we tell you, right, not to trust your enemy, which your enemy, right, you Israelites' enemy is the Edomites, man, But let's go back. I want to touch on, this Chat GPT, right? When I ask the question, it says, what is remigration, right? And how does it affect blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans who have been here for generations, right? It says remigration is a political slogan that pops up in far-right groups in Europe and the US, right? It basically means forcibly or heavily pressuring certain immigrant groups or their descendants to leave a country and return somewhere else, so kicking them out. Right, forcibly, right, by force. And how are they doing that, right? They got ICE going around, man. They got ICE going around, snatching people up, and again, right, they're upping their force, right? I think it hit 200,000 applicants or something like that. A little more than 200,000 applicants, to ICE, man. Right? And a lot of these people are, ultimately not qualified or whatnot, but hey, a lot of these people are, right? Ultimately, if you're an Edomite that's somewhat shape, you can fire a gun, hey, you're basically qualified, or if you're, because you got even fucking Jakes doing this shit, man. Hey, you got to be, either really an Edomite or you got to really hate your own people, man, which, hey, ultimately that's part of the curses, but nonetheless, right, they got applicants, through the roof, man. Right, through the roof. It says it's not a neutral policy, it's a repackaging of older concepts like ethnic cleansing, right, or mass deportation, right, which ultimately that's exactly what Trump, right, said he was going to do, right, mass deportations, right. It says, but dressed up in a bureaucratic language to sound cleaner than it is, right. Here's the important part: it targets groups based on identity, not behavior. So if Esau is like, oh, you know what, we're coming for the Israelites, right? And this is why he ultimately set up that, I think there was that bill or whatnot, or the I don't want to say Supreme Court basically ultimately allowed it for it, right? For him to come at people based off of their what they look like, right? Their job, right? Their occupation, you know, and whether they speak Spanish or not, man. You know, that was ultimately, you know, allowed, right? So he can basically go off of, you know, what if you look like an Israelite, hey, well, guess what? You must be an Israelite. We're just gonna, you know, we're gonna apprehend you, you know, and possibly just deport you, because they're not, you know, they're not giving anybody due process, right? They basically have suspended. They haven't gotten rid of it, right? But they basically suspended, or at least it hasn't been put out in the open. They might have gotten rid of it, you know, but they basically have suspended or possibly gotten rid of habeas corpus, which ultimately allows for due process, right? So you going to seeing a judge, pleading your case, so on and so forth. You know, judge will either find you guilty or not. You know, that process, right, has ultimately basically been suspended. They're taking these migrants, right, snatching them up, right, and they're just disappearing, right, or getting sent to countries that they ain't never been to. You know, that they don't originate from, man, right, and being put in prisons and so on and so forth, man. You know, which, hey, that's prophecy as well, right? That they would be, you know, ultimately snatched up out of their homes, right? That's Second Esdras, the 16th chapter, you know, which we're gonna grab, but I want to ultimately get a little bit on this, right? It says, here's the important part. It targets groups based on identity, not behavior, and it treats long-standing communities as outsiders in their own home, right? It says for Black Americans, we're kind of jump around a little bit. I don't want to read too much, but it says for Black Americans, Black people whose family, which we know we're not Black, right? Right? Esau has, you know, called us Black, right? With the word Black is synonymous, right, with evil or bad, which we're not bad. And this is why he paints us in the light that he does in these different movies and whatnot. We always the criminal, man. You know? You know? Which, hey, that's part of the curses, right? Deuteronomy 28th chapter, 37th verse, right? That we would ultimately what? Be called a proverb and a byword. You know, and that's a byword, right? Negro is a byword, right? Black is a byword. You know? African American, you know, that, hey, that's a byword. You know? People would always call us, you know, deadbeats. That's a proverb. You know what I mean? And so on and so forth, man. Right? So, you know, Esau called us Black, right? He called himself white, but he's the wicked that the Bible speaks of, man. Job 9:24, Malachi 1:4, right? Hebrews 12:16, all point Esau, Edom, the self-proclaimed so-called white man today, right? Which is not a color thing, right? But we know majority Edomites are, you know, so-called white, right? They're really not white, right? They're red, you know. But he called himself the, you know, so-called white man, right? Pointing himself out to be, you know, this righteous person, right? But he's not. He's the wicked, man. He's the evil, right? If anything, right? That he's the true Black man. We true, you know. I guess we would be called what? The white people, you know. That's really what it is. It's completely backwards, man. You know. But it says Black people. It says Black people whose families have been in the U.S. for centuries, descended from enslaved Africans, weren't migrants in the traditional sense. They were forcibly imported and built the country's early economy under slavery. That's right, right? And even at times, right, ultimately excelled even in our own, right? Going back to Tulsa, you know, Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? We were doing great, man. We were doing better than Esau was, right? We did, you know, in 20 years what Esau wanted to do, you know, that last 100 years. You know? We did it in 20 years, man. You know, so it just shows you, you know, the difference, man. Right? Esau got jealous. You know, which first and foremost, right, it wasn't time for us to, you know, to have our own shit, especially in our enemy's own land. It's his blessing to have the fatness of the earth, right, not ours. You know, at this current time, right, at this current time. Soon, hey, we're going to have more than what he had, you know, but nonetheless, right, so, hey, and on top of that, right, Esau, you know, being greedy, being evil as hell, right, ultimately bombed us, man, you know. But hey, nonetheless, right, we were still, you know, helping the economy, right? It says a remigration framework pretends they aren't native to the nation's history. Their citizenship is conditional. The legacy of slavery / Jim Crow / civil rights can be erased, which Esau, you know, is trying to get rid of those things, man, right? Because it's what, right? Shameful spewing upon his glory, right? Having all those things, right? Being seen, right? That's why he's trying to close down or remove certain pieces of, what the Smithsonian ultimately shows, right? Trying to get, rid of critical race theory, all that, man. What's the elder Malcolm, right, from Chicago, goes into that heavily, man. And breaks it down how Esau, has systematically, right, set up, this system which is for him, but for, against us, Anyways, right, it says, in other words, it would label the very person. It's like if the very people who helped build the country as foreign, that's not just inaccurate, it's historically incoherent, which is not just the so-called blacks, right? The so-called natives and the so-called Hispanics as well, right? The Israelites as a whole, right? It says for the Hispanics / Latinos, this category is huge and diverse, right? Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Salvadorians, Cubans, Dominicans, Colombians. Now here's the twist, right? Many Hispanics have, and again, they're not called Hispanics, right? They're again, we know them as the northern tribes, right? Issachar, right? Reuben, Gad, Simeon, right? Ephraim or Manasseh, right? Asher, Zebulun, so on and so forth. If I probably left out a few, but it says many Hispanics have ancestry in lands that were part of the U.S. before the U.S. was even the U.S. The Southwest, right, from Texas to California, was Mexico before it was indigenous in territory, right? It says, so a remigration idea tries to shove communities out of territories where their ancestors lived before the United States existed. Spanish and indigenous languages were spoken before English entered the continent. Right, exactly, right? It creates a fictional timeline where these folks suddenly don't belong, right? So, because at the end of the day, where we know that the northern tribes are over here, right? After the Assyrian captivity, right? They ultimately fled over here. They fled over here, right? Which they knew that this land was over here because King Solomon, right, was getting trees from over here, man. To help build right in his kingdom, man. So they knew that this land was over here, right? Which is where they fled to, over here, right? To the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayans, right? Those are the Israelites, man. It says. It says for Native Americans, this one almost breaks the logic machine, right? Native Americans are literally the first people of the continent, right? All the northern tribes, right, have been on that side, man. From America all the way, from Canada all the way down. All the northern tribes, man. It says Native America. It says a policy of migration applied to them collapses instantly because there is no other homeland to send them to. Their homeland is the one everyone else arrived to, right? So even Esau, right? He's technically a migrant, man. He's technically an immigrant, right? He migrated over here, man. And now he's taking everything, man. Which again, right? It's his birthright to do so. But hey, he's being evil. He's being wicked. Hey, that's why you can't trust your enemy, man. This right here is going to affect all. Again, mainly you Israelites. It's going to affect everybody, but mainly you Israelites, because you're his target. Right? We are his target. And he's going to come down having great wrath, as we just read. Right? So I'm going to grab this. Right? I said I'll bring it out earlier, 2nd Ezra 16 and verse 68. Right? It says, for behold, the burning wrath of a great multitude is kindled over you, and they shall take away certain of you, and feed you, being idle with things offered unto idols. And see, Esau, Edom, he can't wait, right? He can't wait, right? He's basically gripping his gun every night, cleaning it, all while meditating at the same time on killing you Jakes, man. Esau is ready to move, and this is why he's moving so fast, This is why we see him moving so fast, man, Because he's ready to move, man. And his ultimate goal, right, is yes, to get rid of you Israelites, but ultimately to establish an NWO in which he has full control over everyone. over everyone, right? Which is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 4, right? Who opposes the Most High, right? And sits himself in the temple of the Most High, as if he is the Most High, right? Roughly paraphrasing. And that's what Esau's goal is. Is to set himself up as the Most High, to remove the Israelites, right? To move Yahweh by Hashem Yahushua, which is impossible, right? And to set himself up as a perpetual ruler over all creation, right? That's what the goal is, man. And give everyone, right, this MO to the TB, right? Which is the RFID micro seed, which ultimately would solidify, that, right? Him having to be able, to see what you think, right? What you feel, where you're going, right? Who you're with, how much you eat, how much you think, right? What you think is right, what you think is wrong, where you go is wrong, where you go is right, so on and so forth. Every little tedious thing, every decision that you make, right? From how long you sleep, right? To how long you use the bathroom, to how long you go to work. He wants control over everything. He wants to be the Most High, And that's ultimately, again, right? That's that ultimate goal, is to give everybody the MO to the TB. He's going to do that by any means necessary. Even if that means having to kill, some people who don't want to take it, and putting people in a position to where they're going to have to take it or they die, which, hey, Lord will, we be of that number. Hey, we're not going to take that charagma, man, right? And we pray that the Lord Yahweh Bashem Al-Shai gives us the strength, right, and the spirit and the faith, right, to stand stiffly, right, in these times that are coming, man, because we know that he's going to be coming for, the men of the Lord, right? Those who are preaching against this system, right? It says, verse 69, it says, and they that consent unto them shall be had in derision and in reproach and trod underfoot. So they're going to kill your ass anyways, man. They're going to mock you, right? They're going to laugh at you, right? And then they very well could, ultimately, put you to death, man. So there's no reason to take it anyways, right? Especially being an Israelite, right? There's no fucking reason to take it, right? Because Yahweh Bashem Al-Shai has got our back. It's proven all throughout history, right? Bible, other secular books, man, right? That proved it. Esau's own scientists and, geologists and whatnot even proved that. Biologists, proved that everything within the scriptures, is 100% true. 100% true. Right? So why would you consent? Right? You'd just be a fool. But continuing on, verse 70, it says, for there shall be in every place and in the next cities a great insurrection upon those that fear the Lord. Right? And we understand that Esau has, Trump and his administration has ultimately put, the ICE agents damn near everywhere already, right? National Guard is being spread around right now, but that's the goal, right? It's to come, because even, in Revelation, the 3rd chapter, the 10th verse, it tells you this is a time that's going to try the whole world, so this is why you see, right? It's not just going to be, here, because you even broke it down at the very beginning, right? That remigration, is ultimately a topic that's been popping up in, on the right, the right group or the far right group within Europe and in America, right? So this isn't just a, a mindset that's being pushed over here by Trump, right? It's being pushed all over the world, right? And we understand that the Israelites, right, have been scattered into every nation, on the planet, This is why we say it's Jacob's trouble, man, because those are, the Israelites are going to be the ones that are, at the forefront, right, of all the judgment, right, and attacks and death, right, that's going to happen, and take place in at the peak, right, of Jacob's trouble, man, right, and leading up to the very peak as well, right? But it says what? Still spoiling and destroying those that fear the Lord, because yes, Israel is, as a nation, right, the target, right, for Esau, Edom, right? But really, it's who? The men of the Lord, right? Those who speak up against, right, this system, those who speak up against, Esau, Edom's, agenda and blow the trumpet on it, right? To let everybody else know, hey, technically, right, that's treason, man, that's treason. And then, ultimately, hey, what? Esau's going to come after us, man, and try to ultimately pin it as, right, us doing some kind of crime or being terrorist or being treasonous or something. When in reality, hey, we're just telling the truth, right? And he knows that, but he can't have everybody else know that, which is why you see all these different psyops, man. The accuser of our brethren, Esau basically setting everything up to accuse the prophets, It says, for they shall waste and take away their goods and cast them out of their houses, right? So he's going to be breaking into these homes, right? ICE was doing it earlier, right? Kicked into a Portland home, man, and basically, snatched whoever up, they didn't give a shit, right? In Chicago, right? Those 300 homes, or the 100 homes, 300 officers, right? Of the ATF, the FBI, ICE, 300 bringing babies out, with not babies literally, but toddlers, older little kids and whatnot, zip tying them, pulling them out of their homes, man, which is, there's eyewitnesses and whatnot, right, mate, bringing out these accounts, he's saying fuck them kids. That's exactly what they were saying, man, so we're in these times already, man, but again, it's only going to continue to get worse, right? For greater evils, right, than thou hast seen happen, right, shall happen hereafter, roughly paraphrasing, it says, then shall they be known who are my chosen, and they shall be tried as gold in the fire, because, hey, Lord, will we be of the elect, right? As we continue to stand stiffly for the name of Yahweh Shai in these times, right? Great miracles are going to be done, for the elect, man, right? The Lord Yahweh Shai is going to, raise up a standard, right? As we read in Isaiah 59 and 19, right? For the elect, and that's going to look, man, out of this world, right? Because it is going to be, it's going to be, it's not going to be, a carnal deliverance, right? Like you see a lot of these people, right, in these movies and what I know, man, Yahweh Shai is going to do something great and marvelous, right, for his elect in these times, man. All the way up until, again, right, the actual deliverance, and we believe that through faith, man, but I keep reading, Lord will, I'll go in, on the spiritual power, right, that spiritual intervention, or not intervention, what is that word I was looking for? Yeah, where he intervenes, right, ultimately delivers, right, steps in, is what I was looking for, Salakia, but, all the way up into that, up into that moment, man. Lord going to be doing miracles for the elect, man. Lord will, I'll be able to touch on that in another lesson, but I'll keep reading. Verse 74, it says, "Hear, O ye my beloved." And when you go into that word, David, right, in the Hebrew, it means beloved, right? So this is speaking to the Bayaf Dawadav, right, the house of David, the elect, right, of the nation of Israel, right? It says, saith the Lord, behold, the days of trouble are at hand, right? We're in Jacob's trouble now, right? But we haven't hit the peak, right? We just got into Jacob's trouble. We just got into Jacob's trouble, but again, you have to understand it's going to get a hell of a lot worse, man. A hell of a lot worse than what you see here. Right? You read about 70 AD. We just read in the Josephus, right, which was heavy. And I only read, a little bit of it. I didn't get to read the whole thing, But yeah, Lord will, I'll be able to go back and read a little bit more. But hey, it's vivid, man. Gruesome, about, ultimately what happened, right, in 70 AD, man, right, the sieging of Jerusalem, right, by the Romans, man, the ancient Romans, right, we're in Rome 2.0 today, but nonetheless, it's going to be far worse, as we read in Jeremiah 30 and verse 7, the time that's coming is going to be far worse, So, Lord, again, right, it's only going to get worse from here, right? I'll read it again, right? Verse 74, "Hear, O ye my beloved, saith the Lord, behold, the days of trouble are at hand, but I will deliver you from the same," right? So the Lord's telling the elect, right, speaking to the elect, which, Lord, we're of that number, right? We're part of the hopeful elect, right? We say hopeful because we hope we're part of the elect, man. We don't know yet, again, but Lord will, right? We all be a part of that number, right? It says, behold, the days of trouble are at hand, but I will deliver you from the same. So again, right, the Lord will, you know, and we're gonna see some, you know, some beautiful deliverances, man. You know, in the coming months, right? You know, in the coming years, months, right? Possibly weeks, days. You know, it says, be ye not afraid, neither doubt, for the Most High is your guide, right? We can't, you know, He gave us not the spirit of fear, nor, you know, but a power of love and of a sound mind, right? So we can't, you know, be out here doubting, man. We got to fully trust and believe in Yahweh Shem Shai. Cast not away your confidence, right? Which has a great recompense reward, right? It's Hebrews 10, right, in verse 36, right, if I'm not mistaken. You know? 35, 36, you know? Verse 76, it says, and the God of them who keep my commandments and precepts, saith the Lord power. Let not your sins weigh you down. Let not your iniquities lift up themselves. That's right, man. Right? So, hey, stay on your P's and Q's. You know, scriptures say that a righteous man falls 7 times, you know, but get back up, right? So, hey, we're gonna ultimately, you know, commit trespass and a miss and whatnot, but hey, you know, don't let that weigh you down. Just stay focused, right, on Yahweh Shem Shai, receiving this, you know, you know, staying faithful to Yahweh Shem Shai first and foremost, right, and receiving the reward, right, the promise, you know. Keep your eye focused, man. You know, but hey, there's a lot coming, man. Prophecy is hidden, right? And we understand it. We see Esau's psyops, you know, at play, you know, and we see, you know, ultimately through the Spirit, man, what's about to, you know, transpire, man. So stay prayed up, right? Stay watching, right? Stay focused on Yahweh Shem Shai, man. You know. But with that, Lord wills, that I find Lord will straight to the point. I want to give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem. Rachak Wadash that belongs to the elder apostles, elder bishops, the elders, and great millstone. Until next time, I say shalom.